Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Terumos, chapter 3, Halacha 3, in the art scroll on page 30b1. This is part 2 of the shir. And when we left off, we were wondering what happens if somebody designates truma, but they're not saying exactly where it is. They didn't say where it is in the pile. And they just said that it's in the north side of the pile. They didn't say like, oh, it's right here in this specific part. Well, there's a maloket on what's going to be a mixture, because there is a part that now is truma, and there's a part that, according to the sages, is also going to be chulin. It's going to be a mixture of both. And the question is, how far does this go? So when we left off yesterday, when you designated the truma of this pile that's going to say, oh, it's in the northern side, Rebbe is going to say that it's half the pile. Half the pile is a mixture. It's an uncertainty, and it's uncertainty because part of the pile has a mixture of truma and chulin, and it's rectified. But the idea is that the southern half, you can totally eat it. It's totally fine. There's a second opinion that we left off on with the sages. The sages were saying that you make an X in the pile, across the whole pile, and you're making it like a pizza pie, and it's going to be one quarter of this is going to be. The northern quarter is going to be a mixture. You have to sell it to the Kohanim at a discount, but the rest of it you can eat. Now we're going to get to the third opinion. The Gemara says this third opinion and says that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said that one who declares his truma to be in the northern side of the pile, that it means to take his truma from the northern part of the northern side. So Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is going to be saying that actually you're not exactly making a pizza, but 1/8 of the pile is going to be this demua mixture, this mixture that has within it truma and also chulin, and then the rest of it's going to be chulin by itself. So he's a little bit more specific than the sages. The sages say that it's going to be a quarter, and the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is to say the northern part of the northern part. So basically what you're going to do, let's say you draw the pile in half, and then you draw the line in half again, and then he's going to be saying that that northern part that's parallel of these dividing lines is going to be that. And so he's going to come up with 1/8 of the entire pile, and this is going to be not the halacha, but according to this interpretation, says the Gemara, 1/8 of the pile becomes a mixture of truma and chulin, and from this brisa, by particularly defining the location of the truma, what he's doing is he's saying effectively, says Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, that in the northern side of the pile, he doesn't mean the entire north side. He's only saying the smallest possible percentage. And he's saying that it's still an effective designation, but the location has been particularly defined, and also the location of the chulin has been particularly defined. And it turns out when you look at the Chazan Ish, he's going to be saying that there are Rishonim who maintain that the partial definition of truma does not suffice, it's not enough, and the Chazan Ish is saying that the halacha follows the view that the partial definition is enough. So the Gemara is going to talk about different cases that explore the limits of how defined this truma has to be. And again, what we're dealing with is, okay, this is effective because the location of truma has been partially defined, and it also by doing that set out where is the chulin. So we get to the next complexity, and it says if somebody now had 2 piles of tevel, so you now have 2 piles of grain, And he said the truma of these two piles is hereby designated in one of them, but he doesn't say which. So the issue here is going to be the subject of a lot of issues, and the explanation that we're going to use is going to be the Pnei Moshe. So the Pnei Moshe is going to be saying that the truma was declared in the customary way. In other words, the owner added that it should also take effect on the northern side or the southern side of the pile. And he's saying that even though the Gemara doesn't actually say it, this is what's to be understood. And just as we have been talking about. But the uncertainty here, says the Pnei Yeshua, Pnei Moshe, is that in our case, we see that the fact that he didn't specify which of the two piles should have truma, the question is what happened. So had he not added that the truma should be in the northern part or the southern part of the piles, the truma would certainly not take effect, since nothing would be known about the truma's location, and also, by the way, nothing would be known about the hulin's location. So the halacha follows the view of the sages, who say that a truma designation can't take effect unless the location is defined. Again, when you're defining the location, you're doing two things. You're saying, where is it that the truma is, and where is it that, by definition, the hulin is, because that's what's left. And so that's why you have to be specific according to the sages. Now, Rabbi Yochanan is saying about this that the trumos of both have become sanctified in a state of demua. In other words, the truma for both piles has taken effect in one of them, even though you don't know which one contains the truma. Now, the Pnei Moshe is going to explain it like this, that the northern side of each pile is forbidden to a non-Kohen, because that might be truma. And the remainder of each pile is permitted, since it definitely does not contain any truma. And this satisfies the requirement that the truma be assigned to a definite place. And the hulin, by the way, is going to also be the remainder, and that has to also be recognizable. So Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish dissents, and he says that they do not become sanctified in a state of demua, and actually both piles remain in a state of tevel. So Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is holding that assigning to truma a place within a pile can't be considered defining its place when the identity of the pile can't be known. So when you try to locate the truma, a person has to identify which pile it's in before he can refine his search by determining where in the pile it is. So the question that he's bringing up is, which pile should take precedence? And it should be noted that Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish are both talking about becoming sanctified in a state of demua. In other words, they're saying that the truma, if it were to take effect, it would be, defined as part of the pile. And, part of the pile is going to be truma, and part of the pile is going to be hulin. It's going to be mixed up. So the idea, says the Pnei Moshe, is that both Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish follow the view of the sages of our Mishnah, but they're disagreeing only on the degree of definition required by the sages, particularly when you have two piles. And you didn't go as far as to say, oh, it's in pile number one. That's going to be the question. Now, the Gemara is going to present two different rulings on similar cases. Rabbi Hoshaya, the son of Rabbi Shammai, that's not related to Bet Shammai, by the way, says that if one had before him two sa'ah of tevel, in other words, there's two containers, and there's a sa'ah in each of these containers. This, by the way, you can see in a Bavli parallel, Sachim 44a. But anyway, he then, it says the Gemara, has, in addition to one whole pile of tevel, and he says that one of these two sa'ah is hereby made into truma on behalf of this other pile, but he doesn't say which sa'ah. In other words, it says the Gemara, he has sanctified one of the sa'ah as truma, but it's not known which one. So the pile of produce now is chulin, and it's permitted to a non-kohen. But the idea here, says the Rosh Hashanah, is that the two sa'as, however, both are forbidden even to a kohen, since one is truma, the other is tevel. Now, the tevel of one can be rectified by separating truma on behalf of another source of tevel. In other words, you have to go get a third pile. And in this way, both sa'ah can be consumed by a kohen according to the laws of truma. They also both can be sold to a kohen for the price of one of them. That's the idea in the Derech Hamuna. But the idea is that although it's not known which of these two boxes of the sa'ah has been designated to serve as truma, the truma is considered defined. Why? Because it's been designated in a particular sa'ah. And since each sa'ah stands alone in a separate container, the truma has been designated in a defined unit and a separate container. And the truma has been designated in a defined unit, and the fact that we can't identify which defined unit does not prevent the truma from taking place. In other words, what did you do by making this unclear designation? You ended up designating one of them. You just don't know which one. But one of them is designated. And now the question is how to clean up this mess. Well, you can get a third pile, and you can designate the uncertain one from the third pile as well as the third pile if you're going to be more specific. Now, there's another ruling, and it says if one had before him two piles of tevel, and he separated a sa'ah of tevel, and he said, this sa'ah is hereby truma for one of these two piles of produce, but he doesn't say which of the two piles it is, then it says that one of them has been rectified, but we don't know which one. In other words, he goes ahead and he makes a truma designation, and that takes effect, and therefore there's one pile that is now going to be chulin. And by the way, there's also one pile that's not rectified, because he only rectified one, and one pile is going to be tevel. But the problem is you don't know which is which. You don't know which one is going to be. Why? Because you have to treat both of them as possible tevel. So to remove the doubt, says the Derech Hamuna in 136, the truma must be separated from another source of tevel, in other words, this third pile, on behalf of whichever pile remained unrectified. So in this case, says Rosh Hashanah, the identity of the truma is known, but the identity of the chulin is not known. And Rabbi Hushai is teaching as long as the truma and the chulin are distinct from one another, whether it is the truma that is clearly known or the chulin is clearly known, the truma designation takes effect. Now, the law in both of these cases is basically the same, and the Gemara is using the term that is rectified. So in both, it's teaching that the truma designation took effect, but the problem is you did it in a way that creates doubt as to which one it is. Now, we're going to get into what happens if you're doing tithing out of order, and the Mishnah is going to be talking about where it says if one advances the separations of truma ahead of the separation of Beurim, or the separation of Ma'aser Rishon ahead of the separation of truma, or the separation of Ma'aser Sheni ahead of the separation of Ma'aser Rishon, that even though he violates a negative commandment, by doing so, what he has done, he has done. And this, by the way, is assuming that the Beurim is detached from the ground. So you have everything attached from the ground, and now you're doing it. Beurim, by the way, is supposed to be when it's still attached to the tree or the ground, but for whatever reason the guy didn't take Beurim, he separated it. Now, after everything's separated, he wants to take out Beurim, but the problem now is he does it out of order. He takes truma ahead of Beurim. What do? So, again, you're going to end up with piles or designations that also have a question of doubt. And the verse talked about in this Mishnah is saying that the prohibition to deviate from the prescribed sequence of tithes, it doesn't say that the tithe takes effect even if they're designated out of order. So the Gemara is going to explain the source of this law. The Gemara says Rabbi Chama, the son of Rabbi Ukva, says the name Rabbi Yosef, son of Rabbi Hanina, from the very fact that one transgresses a negative commandment when he deviates from the prescribed sequence, you can infer that what he has done is in fact legally done, and the tithes take effect. So Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Hanina, is saying that it's inconceivable that somebody transgressed a prohibition unless he accomplished something. And merely attempting but failing, this is the explanation of the Mara Fulda, is going to be that he failed to, by failing to alter the tithing sequence, it's not sufficient grounds for a transgression. In other words, you tried to do something, but you didn't do anything. And that's not enough, he says. So therefore, we're going to say that the action is effective, and that's why he transgressed the prohibition. So, in other words, if you tithed it in a way that nothing happened because it was done wrong, you didn't, even though you tithed it out of order, you didn't tithe it out of order because you didn't do anything. But if it does take effect by tithing out of order, then you did do the negative commandment. In other words, it did take effect, but because it did take effect, you violated the negative commandment in the Torah not to tithe out of order. So generally, somebody who violates a negative commandment is going to be subject to makot, that's going to be lashes. And now we want to know, if you're tithing out of order, do you also get makot? Rabbi Chama bar Ukva says in the name of Rabbi Yosef, son of Rabbi Hanina, it says that one who tithes out of order is subject to lashes for violating the negative commandment of your fullness offering, you shall not delay. And so there's a general rule that one who does not incur lashes for a negative commandment that does not involve an action. So tithing out of order would be the exception of the rule. And, we speak of a case where he designated it mentally without separating it physically. And since, as a result of his declaration, the tevel was transformed into truma or to meiser, his declaration is considered an action. And so there's another opinion. Rabbi Zera says that they asked the following question for Rabbi Yochanan, and he was silent. And what does the Mishnah mean when it states that he transgressed a negative commandment by tithing out of order? The question is he subject to lashes or is he not subject to lashes? Now, maybe the silence by Rabbi Yochanan indicates that he's uncertain about the matter. And there's a different version of Rabbi Yochanan's opinion. Rabbi Yaakov Bar Acha arrived and said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that he's not subject to lashes for transgressing this prohibition. And according to that version, Rabbi Yochanan is giving a definite opinion that there are no lashes for this. The Gemara is going to give an explanation of Rabbi Yochanan's position. It says, to what does Rabbi Yochanan apply the verse where it says that your fullness offering and your truma you shall not delay? And the idea why you wouldn't get lashes, he's going to be saying that the verse establishes this is a negative commandment, so why should this transgression not be punishable by lashes? And the Gemara answers that Rabbi Yochanan understands the verse talking about another matter. He's going to be saying that he interprets the verse as referring to the obligation of Beur rather than tithing out of order. In other words, that there's always a rule that one verse gets ascribed to one law, and he's saying that the law of Beur maestros, in other words, the removal of maestros, requires someone to distribute all the Terumos and maestros in his possession to their designated recipients. In other words, it has to go to a Goan, that's the Truma, and the Meiser Rishon has to go to a Levi. And this, by the way, has to be done before the last day of Pesach in the 4th and the 7th years of the Shemitah cycle. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, where it's saying your fullness offering you shall not delay, it doesn't talk about tithing in order or out of order. It's just teaching that somebody has to not withhold the necessary tithes after the time of your maestros. In other words, although the Mishnah gives us this verse as an injunction against tithing out of order, Rabbi Yochanan is saying this is an asmata, and this is a rabbinic allusion, a rabbinic prohibition, and it's not punishable by lashes. So Rabbi Yochanan is saying that it's rabbinically forbidden to tithe out of order, but not biblically so. And according to the Tanakh, there's another way to to look at this, says commentary from the Mechilta talking about this, where according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov over there in the Mechilta, it's prohibiting delaying the distribution of tithes. And in other words, that's another way to look at it. Now, the Bavli is going to look at this a little bit different, and the Bavli is going to be saying that it's clear that tithing out of order is considered a biblical prohibition, and this is going to be how Rabbi Yosef, son of Rabbi Hanina, is interpreting this Gemara, and what the Tanaim are saying, as explained by the Vilna Goan. However, the Bavli is bringing up a dispute in Torah, page 3 and also page 5 and 4, between Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Hanina, as to whether tithing out of order is subject to lashes. And after assuming initially that Rabbi Yosef bar Hanina is the one who holds that it is subject to lashes, the Gemara concludes that it's really Rabbi Elazar's view, and it's actually the opinions are switched. So there is a difference between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi as to what does Rabbi Yosef, son of Rabbi Hanina, actually hold. So the Bavli version concludes that it's actually switched, and the idea basically is that this verse is talking about tithing, and then making sure that you're giving the tithe to the Goan or the Levi, and to not delay. And Rabbi Yochanan is basically saying that it doesn't mean to tithe out of order. You're not supposed to do that anyway by rabbinic injunction. It's not a biblical injunction, but that this verse is really saying that you have to give it to the Goan or the Levi right away, not to delay. And the Gemara now is going to talk about this prohibition against tithing out of order. And it says, at what point does he transgress the prohibition? For instance, if he separates Truma ahead of Beurim, does he transgress this prohibition as soon as he separates the Truma, or not until he separates the Beurim afterward? And since the prohibition is stated in terms of delaying an earlier tithe until the later one, where it says, like, your fullness offering and your Truma you shall not delay, it can be argued that the prohibition is not violated until the earlier one, like the Beurim, has been separated as well. So the question is, at what point does this take effect? Rabbi Chia Barba says that he transgresses it from the very beginning. In other words, as soon as he designates the Truma before the Beurim, and Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak says that he transgresses the prohibition at the end when he goes ahead and designates the Beurim. In other words, that only after taking it out of order and you've established the incorrect order are you liable. And the Gemara says, what emerges as a difference between these two opinions? Then the difference is going to be that between them, it's regarded as a case where the pile was burnt. In other words, where it's burnt means that after you designated Truma and before you took out Beurim, the pile got burnt up. So, according to that opinion of Rabbi Chia Barva, that he transgresses the prohibition, he will likely never separate out Beurim. And according to the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel bar Yitzchak, he did not transgress the prohibition. Why? Because he can never separate Beurim. So, another way to look at this is going to be that one is obligated. The question is, are you obligated to burn a pile if you did it out of order? And according to Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, since the prohibition is not transgressed until he separated Beurim as well, he should not separate that tithe so as to avoid transgressing a prohibition, and he therefore should burn the pile so that nobody can take the tithes out of it afterward and do it out of order. And according to Rabbi Chia Barva, there's nothing to be gained from burning the pile since he already transgressed the prohibition as soon as he separated out the Truma. Again, keep in mind that the Beurim was not taken out of this. So the Gemara presents a related question, and it says, Rabbi Shmuel bar Abba asks, and it says, in the case of Meiser Rishon that he took early when the grain was still in the ears and he did not, and it was not yet obligated to tithes, does one transgress the prohibition against tithing out of order, or does one not transgress this prohibition unless the grain is already obligated in the order of tithes? In other words, and this the Gemara is going to leave unresolved, but really what it's asking is this: would this take effect only once the grain has been threshed and it's processed in the field and you've completed it into heaping it into pile and then it's smooth? Or if it's already been cut from the ground but you didn't actually smooth it and you took out the Meiser Rishon ahead of it, does that still count as Meiser Rishon? And you've inverted the order of taking things out even before the where the smoothing happens. That's the Gemara Halacha. And the question is, can even fully processed produce not be obligated in tithes until it sees the face of a house? And the question is, how far can it go? And can you even do it before you've done smoothing? And so the Mishnah was teaching before that Beurim should precede the Truma, and the Gemara now talks about a brisa that seems to be at odds with the Mishnah, and then we're going to finish up with this. Basically, there was a brisa that was taught in the presence of Rabbi Abahu. This is a Tosefta from Terumos 4:10, and it says that the separation of Beurim is not critical to the consumption of Truma, and if Truma was separated ahead of Beurim, that Cohen may eat it without separating Beurim from it. So this is basically saying that if somebody advanced Truma ahead of Beurim, or even Meiser Rishon ahead of Truma, or even Meiser Shini ahead of Meiser Rishon, that he may not eat the Meiser Rishon until he separates Truma from it, or the Meiser Shini until he separates Meiser Rishon from it. But Beurim is not critical to Truma. So we see from it that the Beurim does not need to go ahead of the Truma. Again, this is assuming that it's already been cut from the tree or from the ground. And we're learning elsewhere that whenever somebody tithes, that if the later one was separated before the earlier one, the later one may not be eaten until the earlier one has been separated. So if Beurim has to precede Truma because the Torah says so, then a Kohen would not be permitted to eat the Truma until he went ahead and separated Beurim. But this brisa is saying that he can. So it should seem that maybe the Beurim does not need to be separated ahead of the Truma, and maybe this is saying something different from the Mishnah. And Rabbi Abahu is going to answer. He's going to say that this brisa is the opinion of Abba Penimon, and that according to him, somebody who separates Truma ahead of Beurim does not transgress the prohibition against reversing the tithes. And so Gemara is going to seek clarification. Rabbi Yosei asks and says, where is this opinion of Abba Penimon stated? And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Mana said to Rabbi Yosei, says, I have heard from my father the teaching as follows. By the way, Rabbi Mana, this is the Rabbi Mana whose father was Rabbi Yonah, who was Rabbi Yosei's colleague. And it says that if somebody separated Beurim with his right hand and simultaneously separated Truma with his left hand, there's a teacher, Brises, who teaches that he thereby transgressed the prohibition against tithing out of order. How did he tithe out of order? In this case, the order is supposed to be sequential. It's supposed to go one at a time. How did this guy violate it? He did it at the same time. So the Gemara says that there's another teacher, Brises, who's teaching that he does not transgress this prohibition. And my father, Rabbi Yonah, continued and said that the one who says that he transgressed the prohibition is the rabbis, and the one who says that he does not transgress the prohibition is Abba Penimon. So the idea is going to be that Rabbi Yonah had a tradition that he was the author, and the brisa does not require Beurim to precede the Truma. And basically, the question in this case is going to be if you're separating out tithes simultaneously. Why does that matter if you're separating tithes out simultaneously? Well, you might end up saying, oh, well, in the northern part of the northern pile, I'm separating out the Truma, Meiser Rishon, Truma Gedola, and Meiser Shini, and I'm doing that simultaneously. you're not supposed to do it simultaneously. That's what the sages are saying. And why are the sages saying that? They're saying because you're supposed to do it sequential. You're supposed to do it one after the other. You're not supposed to do it at the same time. And you end up with some math problems if you try to do it at the same time versus if you do it sequentially. And you also end up with some suffix as to like, well, which part has this? Why would you end up with some suffix? Well, the Truma Gadola is unspecified in terms of, like exactly how much is supposed to be taken out. And what if you take out 1/50th, 1/60th? And also you're not supposed to measure it. It's supposed to be by estimate. And then the next parts are supposed to be by measurement. So Meiser Rishon and the Meiser Sheni and the Truma Gadola, those are the Truma Meiser. I mean, those are all by measurement. Those are exact, and the Torah gives exact numbers for it. So by doing them all at the same time, the sages are going to say you end up with a prohibition against tithing out of order, but you end up with a practical reason why that is, because which part, how much. One is something that's by estimate, not measured, and then everything else is by measurement. You're doing it all at the same time. How do you get that right? And that's why you do it sequentially. And that's basically the idea the sages are saying why you have to do it in order. Have a great day.